Hello, happy Friday. It's me, Alex Cox again, back with another installment of Fridays Live. I'm gonna give it a couple of moments. I can see that we've got one person watching already. Hello. I'll give it a few moments until a few others have joined, and then we will begin in earnest. So yeah, just give it a few more moments. Thank you to the 11 of you who have turned up incredibly promptly. Already here, ready to go. Hope you've all had lovely weeks. Hello, lovely to see you. How are you doing? Happy Friday. Up to 41, brilliant. We'll give it a few more moments. Let it climb a little bit more. Give it a minute or so, and then we'll kick off. Hello, Rosie. How are you? Oh, it's already dark. I must admit, I'm very much looking forward to when the evenings start brightening up, which shouldn't be too long, actually. It's going to be spring before we know it. All right, brilliant. Well, we're up to about 88, 90, so we might as well kick off. Well, thank you for tuning in. As usual, it is me, Alex Cox, here to talk about all things family history, the new records we've added. Hello, Sylvia. Hello, Amanda. Hello, Pancho. How you doing? But what are we talking about this week? Well, as tomorrow is Burns night, it wouldn't be right to not touch on Scottish genealogy, Scottish records, the great man himself, and maybe Scottish poetry in general. So there's some really fun stuff to discuss today that I'm really looking forward to. So obviously with it being Burns night, I thought we'd have a little look at the Burns family tree. Not going into any great detail, but there were two things Robert Burns was very, very good at. One was writing poems, the other one was having kids. Robbie Burns loved women, and women seemingly loved Robbie Burns. And to say he sowed his wild oats would be somewhat of an understatement. And as a result, there are many, 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 many living descendants of Robbie Burns knocking around today. Who knows? You may be one. It isn't. He had so many children and grandchildren and great grandchildren, and it kept on going that if you have Scottish roots, there is a chance you could be related. I have seen online somewhere someone estimated they did some calculations, and they estimated that it's up to around 5% of the modern day population of Scotland could be a direct descendant of Burns. I've got nothing to back that up, but reading through it, the maths didn't seem to add up. So yeah, who knows? So we'll be having a look at Robbie Burns' interesting life and the many, many children he had. As well, as I said, we've released some very exciting new Scottish records, as well as updates to our existing ones. And we will finish it up with something that I've been really looking forward to talking about, which is the incredible story of the one, the only William Topaz McGonagall, who easily Scotland's worst poet, but he may well be the world's worst poet in the history of poetry. I know that's quite a bold statement, but he was pretty bad. But despite a lack of any discernible talent, he led a very, very, very interesting life, reached quite a remarkable degree of celebrity, actually. And as a result, he is all over our newspaper collections. The lives of him and his relatives are very well documented in our collections of Scottish records. But there's some really fantastic newspaper reports about him. Also examples of his interesting work, let's say. But one of the favorite things I found, which I'm going to be talking about towards the end of this video, is an interview with the great man himself, an interview with William Topaz McGonagall McGonagall he gave in 1880. It's a kind of mix of tragic and humorous, really, because the interviewer was mercilessly taking the mick, and I don't think William really caught on. I mean, to this day, there is debate around whether William was that blind to criticism and that confident of his own genius that he was like water off a duck's back. But some have wondered maybe he was actually a comic genius in disguise, and all of this was an act. and he was basically playing some kind of music hall character. I'm not so sure, because when you read the interview with him, and when you read a lot of the reports of the terrible, terrible abuse he received, he actually ended up fleeing Dundee after repeated threats to leave for good. He did eventually end up coming good on his threat and leaving the city. And I can't see that he would have willingly subjected himself to that much scorn, laughter, ridicule, and abuse if it was all part of an act. But anyway, he had an incredible life. He wrote some incredibly bad poems. And I very much look forward to telling you a little bit about what we have found out about the wonderful William McGonagall. So yeah, thank you again if you've just tuned in. Just going over the theme is Scottish records, Scottish poets, and the Burns family. So we, after we've taken a look at the new records we've added this week, we'll have a quick look at Burns family tree, and then we will dive headfirst into the wonderful story of the weird, the eccentric William Topaz McGonagall. I do think like the British Isles has this great tradition of producing really, really eccentric characters. And I think historically we've always been quite fond of great kind of British or for that matter, Irish eccentrics. And McGonagall really does rank very, very high up the list. And as that's our theme, our question of the week this week, which we do like to ask just to get the conversation going, get the ball rolling, is, as we're talking about artists of various ends of the talent spectrum, did any of your ancestors have artistic tendencies? And I mean that in a very broad sense. Like, were they artists? Were they musicians? Did they play an instrument? Were they a patron of the arts? Did they just have a keen interest? Were they an amateur? Would they practice an art form in an amateur capacity? Have you had any of their works passed down through the family? You know, do you have any heirlooms that are symbolic of your ancestors' artistic pursuits or tendencies? I mean, I do. That's not why I asked these questions, but I can start by giving my own example. I've talked about it many times on here before, but on my mother's side, I've actually come from 3 generations of music hall vaudeville performers. So yeah, 3 generations of ventriloquists, magicians, banjo players, ukulele players, 1 concert pianist. So I like to think there is a little bit of that in my genes, and who knows, maybe that's why I enjoy talking to you guys so much. Maybe that's my performing genes coming to the surface. I don't know. But one of my favorite ancestors was one of these performers. I've talked about him again before, the wonderful Arthur William Crossland, better known by his stage name, Professor Chris Leno. I'm fortunate enough to have one of the adverts for his original performances framed in my flat. I was actually tempted to bring it in and show you guys on camera, but it's about 4 foot tall and very fragile, so I didn't want to damage it. But it's great. The tagline for his show is something I'd quite like to adopt for myself. He wasn't very humble, but it says, the great Professor Chris Leno, this is such a good line, where he says, praised by all, imitated by many, excelled by none. Just those 3 lines, very simple, says it all. Praised by many, no, what's it? Praised by all, imitated by many, excelled by none. So that was it. But let's have a look what some of you guys have said if you've been sharing your wonderful ancestors. And you said, good week this week, bought family tree maker with Christmas money. So just doing some maintenance on my tree since I've been doing it for 10 years. And there are a few wee bits that need tweaking. Oh, wow. Well, I've heard a lot of positive things about family tree maker. Never used it myself, but any feedback you've got on it to share with the rest of our viewers, that would be fantastic. Sylvia, glad to hear it. New release of Scottish Records is needing me to amend my Roots Tech talk again. Well, I'm sorry you're having to amend your talk, but I'm glad that the new records are going to be of some benefit, impact to what you're doing, Sylvia. And Rosie said, the question of the week, her 5 times great-grandparents from somewhere in Scotland, McDonald's, needle in a haystack. So maybe... there you go. This is the other thing I want to say. Right. So apart from question of the week, one of the other main things, if you are just tuning in, apart from just listening to me waffle on about general historical thrash, part of the reason for these videos as well is a place for you guys to hang out, talk to each other, ask for tips and advice. And I'm thrilled to say we have the fantastically knowledgeable Miko Cleland in the comments, who is willing and capable is an understatement of answering any questions you may have about Scottish genealogy, access to records, what's coming up, tips for finding Scottish ancestors. Miko is the man to ask. I must admit, I'm better at English and Welsh research than I am Scottish. I'm starting to broaden my knowledge, but I really do have to defer to Miko's superior abilities when it comes to all things Scottish research. But Miko is also the man we have to thank for a lot of these wonderful Scottish records that we've been releasing. And that's another reason why it's quite exciting to do a Scottish Burns Night Deep broadcast, because over the past 6 months, wow, we've added a lot of Scottish records, an incredible amount for that fact. Our Scottish collection is growing at an exponential rate. It's sorry, I've got a sip of tea. Miko did warn me prior to coming on that I wasn't to get anything wrong, so I'm not going to go into any specifics as to numbers, but I believe we've added way over 6 million records or something over the past since September, I think. Miko can correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, if you have any questions about Scottish research, Scottish genealogy, records, tips, where to look, Miko's your man. This is your opportunity. Get your questions in the comments, and hopefully he will be able to answer. And Miko already chiming in and said, Robbie Burns is a first cousin of mine, many times removed of my own. My ancestors from Dumfries have been buried in the same cemetery as him for centuries. Wow, and that is also a fantastic answer to question of the week. Did any of your ancestors have any artistic tendencies? Well, if your ancestors is Robbie Burns, I think that's a bit of an understatement. And actually, Miko, not to drop you in it, but you've got a few quite interesting artistic ancestors, haven't you? Another Scottish artist got in a bit of bother, didn't he? I believe for some of his artistic works. But it's up to you whether you want to share that story, I guess, Miko. But thank you very much for joining, Miko. Your help and knowledge will be greatly appreciated, I am sure. So Denise McKnight has said, sorry, I just saw Pancho. I won't read your comment, Pancho, but I did enjoy it. I'm sure one of mine was too. Denise said, my grandmother taught piano. Have a great photo of her in her cap and gown when she got her qualifications. I also have a cap and gown in my wardrobe. Did that not tempt you to try tickling the ivories yourself, Denise? As I said, one of my great-grandfather was a concert pianist, and I hoped that his talent may have passed down. I did actually buy a keyboard to teach myself to play piano, and after a couple of weeks, it was glaringly obvious that I have no musical talent whatsoever, and that keyboard has gone back in its box. Who knows, maybe one day. So Anya coming in again, question of the week, loads of artists, even now. Mum's an artist. Fantastic. Cousin is great at playing the flute. My grandfather's cousin was classically trained singer. All family photos gatherings seem to include accordions. Oh, wow. Wouldn't it be great if one of these accordions had stayed in the family and you still have one? DNA suggesting that I probably have an Irish direct ancestor was noted with his occupation as a fiddle player in the 1830s. Oh, wow. Cheers, Miko. I will look out for that. Anyway, I'm already nearly 15 minutes in, so we should probably get cracking. Just a quick reminder, if you're just tuning in, you got Scottish research questions, Miko is here to answer. I think we may also have Ellie in the comments as well. Don't be shy. Share your stories, get your questions in, join the conversation. That is half the fun of these. And Penny Wheeler's quickly said, my paternal great-grandfather's older brothers and sisters were parents. His grandparents, etc., were all from Cullen, Banffshire. He was born after his family moved to Woolwich. However, my maternal great-uncle, Arthur Coles Armstrong, not Scottish, was a critic on Stage magazine and wrote a book of poems called A Tale from Boccaccio. Oh, that is cool, which was published around 1897. A couple of years ago, the British Library reprinted it, and I brought a copy. So made up to have something an ancestor wrote, even though it's not the original. Yeah, that is awesome. You should get you should get that framed. That is so cool. And also, you may not be aware, Penny, but we actually have the Stage magazine in our collection of newspapers. So if you haven't searched there yet, I would suggest that you may even find one of the articles written by your ancestor, and wouldn't that be cool? Oh, and Miko's given me his permission to reveal that Miko the surname is a bit of a giveaway, but Miko is actually descended from none other than the infamous John Cleland, the man who wrote a somewhat famous work entitled Fanny Hill. that I believe led to a very lengthy court case. I think he was even sent away on indecency charges. It's a great story. I must confess I haven't read the book myself, but it did cause quite a stir, and I can't imagine you having boring ancestors, Miko, so it's really not a surprise. And Denise said, Alex never really learned piano, but my daughters both play, and now my eldest granddaughter is learning. So who knows? Maybe there is some kind of genetic memory. Maybe these things are passed along. Sadly, it wasn't in my case, but I do wonder. Nicola, no worries, you're late. Very glad you're here. And Tony said, my ancestors on my dad's side go back as far as 960 AD in Scotland. Whoa! An ancestor was knighted by Queen Mary of Scots. Wow, that is quite a heritage you've got there. Right, what are we releasing this week? Right, so as I said, I'm not going to say as I said a lot this week. Back to the records. So before we dive into Burns's sprawling family tree and the amazing story of William McGonagall, you feel free to ask Miko any questions you got while I'm going through these records. But in celebration of Burns Night, Miko has been hard at work once again and has got for you all another lovely batch of brand new Scottish records. So do you remember all those wonderful records we released back at the end of November, early December, our massive Dundee and Angus collection? Well, we've already added to it, as well as adding 2 brand new collections. I also wanted to give you a quick reminder of our wonderful collection of Scottish photographs that we published back in late November, because I do think what a great way to celebrate Burns Night than wandering the streets of old Scotland. Like, it is amazing. That's the great things about these photos. Like, you can almost take yourself down the streets that your Scottish ancestors would have strolled. And in William McGonagall's case, you see a lot of the locations that are immortalised in his terribly bad poems. But that is just a fantastic collection. I'll post a link once this is over. It's just great to have a flick through. I love old photos. I've got some of the oldest photos in existence in there, dating all the way back to the 1840s. Fantastic collection. But anyway, what have we added this week? So 2 brand new collections. We've got a new collection of Scotland poor law and poor lists. This is quite a meaty one as well. This contains about 123,000 poor relief records. And you're going to get a bit of a mixed bag in there. Let me have a look what you've got. So basically, these are the records that would have been kept by the parochial board, keeping a roll of the poor who needed relief and what relief they received. So not only are these a good way of finding out if your ancestors actually fell on hard times, they're quite detailed. They'll actually tell you quite a lot about the level of destitution your ancestor actually experienced. So every record in this collection has a transcript. Some will also include an image where an original image is available. But the kind of things you can generally expect to see are cool, but like essential, really, biographical details. Things like your ancestor or the poor person might not necessarily be an ancestor. The individual's age, their occupation, their marital status, the year the board was looking at their entitlement to relief. Also, the date that the parochial board discussed this, the place, their residence, so some nice little census substitute bits of info there. But the bits that I think are really interesting is you will also find out whether they were wholly or partially destitute. You'll also find notes on if they were disabled and the level of their disability, maybe even some notes on the nature of that disability. You will also find their earnings, which is quite unusual in family history records. So you'll actually find out how much money they were bringing in. And when you put those figures into something like an inflation calculator, I promise you will probably be quite shocked. As well as all that information, you will get the names of their wife and children, if they have them. You will also find the ages and the weekly earnings of their spouse or children if they were working, the amount of relief they received and a description of what that relief was. And you may also find notes taken by the board while these registers and various papers were being put together. So yeah, poor law collections are always pretty invaluable, and they can act as a really, really great census substitute. And I believe these date back to around 1845, so you've got a nice long date coverage there as well. So next up, our next brand new collection for Scotland that you can use to celebrate Burns Night is our collection of Lanarkshire school registers and records. This is also a pretty chunky one as well, roughly about 30,000 registers and records in there. And the reason I always love school records is when we're doing our family trees, just with the nature of the way the records we use, we tend to kind of skip past our ancestors' childhood. It kind of goes from baptism to marriage, and then you obviously use censuses and stuff to investigate what they did for a career and their occupations. School records give us a really nice, rare glimpse at the childhood years, and yeah, which is something quite special, I think. And as I said, these are a combination of registers and other records, but the lion's share of them will be made up of actual school registers, and they'll tell you the people's name, birth year, birth date, school they attended, obviously, the residence, so their home address, their admission date, their leaving date, the reason they left school, names of their parents and things. So again, you know, these potentially could be records that if you find your ancestors in there, it could provide you with information that unlocks new avenues of research, new things for you to chase and investigate. I should basically just check the comments to make sure I haven't got anything glaringly wrong and Miko's not shouting at me. Many more photos coming too from every corner of the UK, according to Miko, which is very exciting indeed. I mean, honestly, if you haven't checked out that collection yet, do. Like, they have to be seen to be believed. There's some seriously amazing photos of people and of places. Both are equally interesting. There's a great one of a chap called Dr. Crichton, he's kind of, it's really dark and shadowy. I'll post it in the comments after this. There's no point in me describing a photo to you, is there, when I could actually just show you the thing. But anyway, yeah, so we've got those two brand new Scottish collections, which should hopefully be very beneficial for you. But what we've also added is we've done some big old chunky updates to our collections of Dundee and Angus parish records. So these are births and baptisms, marriages and banns, deaths and burials going from about 1562 up to 1855. These are, well, I don't need to explain to many of you why parish records are great. If you're not aware why parish records are great, it's because, as with the two collections we just mentioned, you will often find information in there that will unlock previous generations or other branches of your tree, whether that be parents' names, names of spouses, fathers' occupations, that sort of thing. But yeah, we've added a lot of records to these collections. Over 160,000 baptisms, over 92,000 marriages and banns, and about 74,000 new deaths and burials. And these updates cover every single parish currently covered by these collections. So we're very, very happy to have those. And last but not least, we haven't forgotten about our newspaper fans. We have also added 6 brand new Yorkshire newspaper titles. And if you want to know more about what we've added there, I recommend visiting our Friday's blog, which I will attempt to post in the comments, but apparently you guys can't see blog links until after I have posted them, until after the broadcast is finished. If you want to find it yourself, go to our blog, go to the What's New section of our blog. We post a blog every single Friday, which will list in detail every set we've added or updated, as well as all the newspapers that we've added as well. So you can find out more info there. Hey Angela, no worries. I'm just glad you're here. Oh, as Miko said, yeah, there are some amazing photos of dogs in the photographic collection as well, which is probably one of the most important elements. And Sylvia said, I found my grandfather's elementary school records in Aberdeen archives. We have some school prizes he won in 1890. See, what a lovely little snapshot into his experiences as a child. When he was a pupil at Robert Gordon's school, the school activist was able to supply a lot of information. We are curious about how his parents afforded the fees. Maybe had a generous benefactor or something. Actually, another tip, if you're curious about your ancestors' time at school, one place you probably wouldn't think to look is newspapers. Obviously, the vast majority of the newspapers in our newspaper collection are local newspapers, and as a result, they mainly reported on local news. And you will find lots of reports on school prizes, school shows, kids' fairs. Local newspapers actually dedicated a surprising amount of page space to what was going on at the local school kids. So it's definitely worth a try if you haven't done so already. You never know what you're going to find in newspapers. That's why it's great. Anyway, already 25 minutes in, and I've only just started talking about Robbie Burns, the ploughman poet, the national bard of Scotland, whatever you want to call him. Well, he's the guy who set the theme. So tomorrow, I'm sure some of you will be enjoying a supper of haggis, maybe some neeps and tatties thrown in, or maybe you'll simply just be raising a toast of scotch to the memory of dear old Robbie Burns. Actually, if any of you are doing anything to celebrate Burns Night, let us know. What are you doing? Are you attending a Burns Night party? Will you be having a toast? Will you be dining on haggis, neeps and tatties? Will you be reciting some Burns poetry? We'd love to know. Let us know. I might have a scotch. It's probably about as far as I'll take it. Even though I'm a huge poetry fan now, I really am. So, what is Burns Night? Well, tomorrow marks the 261st birthday of Robbie Burns himself. And essentially that's what it is. It's an annual celebration of the life and works of Scotland's favourite son. Burns became pretty popular at the end of the 18th century. At first, they originally held they were quite a personal thing, held in memoriam by the bard's personal friends and relatives. But now there are Burns societies in pretty much every corner of the world. And these Burns Night suppers are a regular occurrence. They're actually attended by millions of people annually. And you see this in our newspaper collection. I typed in Burns Night supper, and one of the first things I got was a report from 1952 showing photos of a Burns Night supper in the Soviet Union, nonetheless. Sorry. So there you go. But I love the story of Burns. One of the reasons I love it is it's just a great example of how genius can spring up in the unlikeliest of places, and it can come from any background, any walk of life. I mean, I believe there's a quote that some historian made recently being like, how many geniuses like Albert Einstein died in cotton fields or rice paddies, never having the chance to use their talent. But thankfully, despite coming from very, very, very humble roots, Burns was able to. So he was completely self-educated, born to tenant farmers about 2 miles south of Ayr in 1759. And during his life, he produced a lot of works, around 500 different works across his 37 years of life. And as well as that, he produced, as I will touch on shortly, an incredible amount of children. I think kind of enjoying female company and being a little bit amorous probably comes with the territory of being a celebrated poet. But Burns certainly got about. I mean, he almost rivaled Byron. Yeah, he was very, very popular with the ladies. So before we start looking at Burns's very expansive family tree, I'm going to treat you to a few Burns Night facts that you might not be aware of. So according to an article I found in the Nottingham Evening Post from 1940, the inaugural Burns supper was actually held on January the 29th, 1802, to commemorate his birthday, and this was organised by the Greenock Burns Club, which was the very, very first of its kind to be established. And this was a really small thing. It was attended only by local admirers of Burns, as well as a number of his acquaintances. And despite, this is what's quite funny about this one, despite the fact that this was mainly his personal friends and people that actually knew him very well, they actually got the date for the celebration completely wrong. They got his birthday wrong. After examining church records for the parish of Ayr the following year, they discovered that they'd actually missed the anniversary of Burns' birth by 4 days. And as a result, Burns Night suppers have been held on the correct day, the 25th of January, ever since. So there you go. The first one was on the wrong day, and even his mates got his birthday wrong. So as I said, it's really popular worldwide. You've got Burns clubs in every corner of the world. Although the one in Greenock was the first one to be established in 1801, the longest running is probably the Irvine Burns Club, and that was founded on the 2nd of June, 1826. And they've met continuously for about 100, well, probably over 190 years now. I can't do the maths off the top of my head, but yes, easily over 190 years. They've been meeting for a very long time, and at least 5 personal acquaintances, people who actually knew Burns, were the ones who formed this club, including Dr. John Mackenzie, who attended Burns' dying father. So not only knew Burns, but knew his parents, and was the club's first ever president. Another fact I found quite interesting about Robbie Burns was that after Queen Victoria and Christopher Columbus, Robert Burns has more statues dedicated to him around the world than any other non-religious figure. That really surprised me. There are more statues of Robbie Burns, Queen Victoria and Christopher Columbus than any other non-religious figures. So the first one, they think, was placed in Camperdown in Australia. This is actually thought to be the oldest existing statue of the poet anywhere in the world. And we double-checked this in our newspapers, and we found that it was actually carved by a chap called John Greenshield in 1826 and shipped to Australia in the 1850s. So there's certainly evidence to back that claim up. But now down to the salacious bit. I'll just have a quick look at the comments. Yes, you're right. I do mean a whiskey. Didn't study Burns at school. I hate haggis and neeps. Well, I'm actually quite partial to a little bit of haggis and neeps, because then the first country in the world to put well, I must have got my facts wrong. Oh, stamp. I think you said statue. Sorry, I misread your comment, Miko. Well, that's a good fact too. The first country in the world to put Robert Burns on a commemorative stamp was the Soviet Union in 1956. Well, judging by the photos of the Soviet Union Burns night suppers, it sounds like he had quite actually, that makes sense. That makes sense for him to be popular in the Soviet Union. Of course, doesn't it? He had humble roots. He was the son of tenant farmers. That would have, his genius and background would have fed quite well into their ideology, I would have thought. I'm completely plucking that out of thin air, but makes sense, I guess. I'll probably have to verify that. But yeah, it does make sense. I can imagine them liking him, being a ploughman poet. But anyway, on to his frightfully randy ways. So, as I said, one of the things he's equally, so he's very obviously he's famous for his poetry, but he's probably almost equally as well known for his liaisons with the opposite sex. Burns had at least, and I say at least, 12 children that we know of. Some claim the figure could be high as 18, but from what I've seen during my research, 12 confirmed children. And these children had a lot of children of their own. And as a result, his family tree has continued to sprawl out in various directions since his death in 1796. And as of today, there are as many as 900 living relatives that have been actually certified by genealogical researchers. And some of them are quite remarkable. But again, I'll touch on that in a little bit. But who was Burns descended from? Well, Burns was the son of 2 tenant farmers from the Mearns. Again, I've always had this caveat. I apologise for my terrible pronunciations of all things Scottish. I don't claim to be getting it right. That's why I sound strange when I'm saying it. So Mearns, Mearns. So he was one of 7 children. And as you can imagine, the family was quite poor. Tenant farmers, 7 children, many mouths to feed. And actually, Robbie was the back-breaking labour Robbie did for his parents on the farm left him with a damaged back and a weakened constitution. And these were physical ailments that actually did plague him for the rest of his life. So he genuinely did have a very, very tough start in life. He also received very, very little in the way of formal schooling, which is all the more incredible that this fantastic talent and mind emerged, I think. And that's why I love his story so much. It shows that genius can come from anywhere. So while he didn't receive any formal education, he was encouraged to read by his parents and actually showed promise as a writer from quite a young age. By the time he was 15, he was already composing poems. And you can probably guess what Robbie's early poems were about. Anyone willing to have a go? What do you think 15-year-old Robbie Burns was writing poems about? You guessed it, girls. Yes, his earliest works were about the girls who caught his eye while he was acting as the chief labourer of his on his family's farm. So while he had many romantic liaisons, probably the best known woman in Rabi's life was a lady called Jean Amour, which is the woman he married. And a fact that Miko actually told me about this marriage is that they had an irregular marriage. We have their irregular marriage in our collection of irregular marriage records, and apparently this irregular marriage is the only actual surviving evidence that they were genuinely married. So Jean was the daughter of a chap called James Armour and a lady called Mary Smith, and she was born around 1788 in Ayrshire. But the reason I mentioned her father, James Armour, is because James Armour also played quite a role in Robbie's life. At first, James didn't like Robbie. He really didn't like Robbie. Robbie had a bad reputation. So by early 1786, Jean was pregnant. And they weren't married. Robbie got married out of the sanctity of marriage, which back then obviously was viewed very negatively. And while it was argued that Robbie apparently gave her some kind of written acknowledgement of marriage, this kind of a regular marriage thing, Jean's father was adamantly opposed to this. And he actually sent Jean off to relatives in Paisley to get her far away from Robbie's nefarious influence as he could. Robbie was heartbroken. He sent her many letters. All of these were destroyed by James. And James actually went as far as obtaining a legal writ against Robbie to recover damages on behalf of his daughter. But James did eventually change his tune. In 1787, Robbie's star had definitely risen. He was, by that time, a famous poet. And with the fame and success came the acceptance of the Armour family. James finally accepted Robert, and they renewed their relationship. And as I said, there's evidence to suggest they were married privately in April 1788. But it was not until August the 5th that they appeared before the Kirk Sessions. This is the record we have before the Kirk Sessions to acknowledge and accept a rebuke for their irregular marriage. And after this, that's when their marriage was formally recognised. And they finally set up house together in Ellisland in November 1788. But those irregular marriages are very, very interesting records, probably something that deserves another look by us at some point. But who were his children? So of his 12 confirmed children, 9 were to Jean. They kind of had an on and off relationship over the course of several years, but then, of course, they did finally set up a home together in 1788. And of the 9 children she and Robert had together, only 3 survived infancy, sadly. 2 died unnamed shortly after being born. And the others were Jean, Robert, James, William, Elizabeth, Francis, and Maxwell. And sadly, none of those survived infancy. But Jean was a good wife, a long-suffering wife. She can't have been easy for her, but she's also believed to have taken in one of Burns's illegitimate children, Elizabeth Burns, after the death of the child's biological mother. Another one of Burns's romantic liaisons, a lady called Anne Park. And by all accounts, she did the noble thing of raising Elizabeth Burns alongside her own children, making no distinction between them. But Burns's first child is the one I found quite interesting, which just shows what a character he was. His first child wasn't born to Jean. It was an illegitimate child, also named Elizabeth. And Elizabeth, number 1, was actually born to one of the family's servants. I think it was Robert's mother's servant, a lady called Elizabeth Patton, while he was in his mid-20s. Naughty boy. So he continued to sleep with as many women as possible. Many that were effectively his employees, having children by at least 2 of them. And yeah, so he had a lot of kids. But this incident where he was dragged into church and admonished for his irregular marriage had a bit of an effect on him, and it actually led him to write a poem. He was actually quite caustic about the demonization of sex that was present in society at that time, which is why he got bit of a reputation as a womanizer, as well as all the kids he had. But he wrote this poem called The Fornicator, which is a great poem, and it's in it he mocks the church's attempt to shame a pair of young lovers, referring to their finds as a buttock hire, which is probably a bit rude for this broadcast, but I wanted to include that anyway because he had a great way with words. But he was by all accounts also quite a doting father as well. He dedicated poems to some of his children, including a poet's welcome to his love-begotten daughter. And actually, interesting fact, that made him one of the first fathers in recorded history to pen a love letter to his daughter. Did you know that? I didn't. But yeah, he wrote other poems. There was one called Welcome to Bastard Wien. Sorry for my attempt at an accent there again, where he dismisses those who would call him a fornicator and celebrates the wee image of my bonny Betty. So there you go. He had many children. Another woman was a lady called Jenny Clow. She was another servant girl who became pregnant following an affair with Burns. There was another lady called Agnes Nancy McElhose, with whom he exchanged many passionate love letters over the years, and is believed to. She was quite a wealthy woman, quite high up in Edinburgh society, and it's believed they had a dalliance, but didn't result in any children. And yeah, he did send money and offered to take care of many of his illegitimate children. Sometimes that was refused, and other times it was accepted. But it was his wife, Gina Moore, who actually gave birth to his very final child, Maxwell, on the very same day the poet died himself, on the 21st of July, 1976. So there's another quite tragic fact, that Burns' very, very last child was born on the day of his death, 21st of July, 1796. But who are his living descendants? Well, of course, he's got about 900, but the most famous of all Burns' descendants, and there are plenty of unknown ones, is probably Tommy Hilfiger. Yes, the American designer himself, who has never actually set foot in Scotland, is a direct relative of the poet through his elderly aunt, Rose. So Rose's grandmother was the granddaughter of Robbie's younger brother, Gilbert, which makes Tommy Hilfiger, let me see if I can get this right, that makes Tommy Hilfiger Robbie Burns' great nephew. Yes, it does. It makes him great nephew. So Gilbert was also a farmer and part-time poet, but he was Robbie's confidant and best friend for many years, and he also had a lot of kids, which are another reason why the Burns family tree is all over the place. He had 6 sons and 5 daughters. But one of the things I found quite interesting was I found an old interview with Tommy Hilfiger where he said that he wasn't actually particularly proud of that part of his lineage, which shocked me. He gave an interview to Vogue in 2012 where he actually said, "It was never discussed in my house because it was said that Robbie Burns was a womanizer and a boozer. They were embarrassed he was related. So we were told until we were in our teens. We weren't told until we were in our teens or maybe 20s. Well, I say boo to that, Tommy Hilfiger. I would be shouting from the rooftops if I was a descendant of Robbie Burns. And I think the fact that he was a womanizer and a boozer makes him even more of an interesting character. And it adds to his old kind of rock and roll poetic image, I think. I think it does come with the territory of being a celebrated 18th century poet, don't you think? Right. So that was Burns. That was his many kids. Now it's the bit I've been looking forward to. The Wonderfully Weird Life of William Topaz McGonagall. I'll have a quick look at some comments. Fame and Fortune does bring people out of the woodwork. It does indeed. And Sylvia Valentine has said, Kirk Session records are brill. I have a saucy story for Roots Tech and another example of how helpful they are for family history. Oh, if you could share that with me at some point, Sylvia, I would love to hear more about that. And Helen Miller said, my husband's grandfather, John Dryden Miller, was wounded during World War I and ended up with a leg amputated. We found a record of him at Bridgewater Infirmary in 1918. My husband's dad played the bagpipes. That is, wow. I wonder, have you found him in any of the soldiers' medical records, Helen? We do have a pretty big collection of them. They're not a massive collection. I think it's only 2% of all the records that were ever taken. Worth a look. Oh, I just saw another good comment from Cindy Pennington, who said, yeah, we were doing a Burns night supper, hopefully with a wee nip or three. I say three. As we now live in Aberdeen and moved up about 8 years ago. Not even our youngest daughter has a Scottish accent, but she can put an East Coast accent on. But she did lean the mouse one by Burns and gives it a convincing go to our tears. Anyway, that sounds like great fun. Well, enjoy that immensely, Cindy. That does sound like a right laugh. So yeah, who was William Topaz McGonagall? Now we've looked at the national poet of Scotland, it's time to look at a man who was on the complete opposite end of the poetic spectrum, the talent spectrum, I should say. This was a chap, William McGonagall, who was born in 1825. He was an Irish weaver, poet, and actor who Dundee was his adopted home and was the subject of many of his poems, but he won notoriety for his extremely terrible poetry and his complete inability to recognise or perhaps be concerned with the opinions of others when it came to his work. He genuinely didn't care. Water off a duck's back. During his career, his very interesting career, he wrote about 200 poems, the most famous of which was probably the Tay Bridge disaster, the famous Tay Whale, and his works are really genuinely regarded as some of the worst in the history of English literature. And to give you an idea, we can't really talk about them, can we, without giving you an idea. So these are a couple of lines from his 1880 poem, The Railway Bridge on the Silvery Tay. So he said, "Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay, with your numerous arches and pillars in so grand array, and your central girders, which seem to the eye to be almost towering to the sky, to greatest wonder of the day, and a great beautification to the River Tay, most beautiful to be seen, near by Dundee and the Magdalen Green. Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay, that has caused the Emperor of Brazil to leave his home far away, incognito in his dress, and view thee ere he passed along en route to Inverness." Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. Beautiful railway bridge of the Silvery Tay, the longest of the present day that has ever crossed over a tidal river stream, most gigantic to be seen, near by the Dundee and Magdalen Green. I mean, it just keeps on going on. Beautiful railway bridge of Silvery Tay, which will cause great rejoice on the opening day, and hundreds of people will come from far away. Also the Queen, most gorgeous to be seen, near by Dundee and the Magdalen Green. I mean, reading it there, it doesn't sound that bad, really, does it? But once you start exploring his other works, the two they get worse. They get worse. Sorry, I know. I have stopped. So yeah, that's an example of why he was pretty damn bad. But he was actually remarkably popular. Groups throughout Scotland actually engaged him to make recitations of his work, and they were often sold out. They got so rowdy that they eventually ended up being banned by magistrates. I'll touch on that in a second. But his verses do remain popular. Collections of his works are still sold to this day. If you don't have a copy, buy one. It's a good read. And as I said at the very start of this, opinion is divided on whether McGonagall genuinely did believe he was that good, or whether he just did this amazing hoax on everyone, where he was actually doing a musical character and it was a comic ruse the entire time. Some modern historians and literary professors have looked back and thought that actually he may have been on the autistic spectrum or something, or he could have just simply been one of these great British eccentrics, and his life really was. So let's have a quick look at the tumultuous life of McGonagall. So Lampoon is one of the worst poets in British history. Well, actually, I should say the main criticisms of his work is that he was completely deaf to a poetic metaphor. He was unable to scan correctly, which, as you saw, he actually was unable to scan correctly, and that his only understanding of poetry was his belief that it needed to rhyme. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that you can say for his work. It does rhyme. It really does. And when you combine his kind of inappropriate rhythms, his weak use of vocabulary, his ill-advised imagery, it all kind of creates this perfect storm that has resulted in the worst poetry in the in the history of the English language. So, who was he? His parents were Charles and Margaret. They were Irish. His surname was a variation of McCongale, which is quite a popular name in County Donegal. But throughout his adult life, McGonagall himself claimed to actually be from Edinburgh. He gave his year of birth variously as 1825 or 1830. No one's been able to prove this for certain, but his entry in the 1841 census gives his birthplace, like that of his parents, as Ireland. And there's quite a good chance he would have falsified his place of birth, because a native-born Scotsman would have been better treated under the Poor Law Act of 1845 than one born in Ireland. So he had a clear incentive to hide the fact that he was of Irish extraction. And when you look at him in census records, marriage records, death records, he's actually found in our Dundee records. You can find his marriage in those records. It looks like 1825 is probably the most likely year for his birth, but no one has been able to prove that conclusively. To this day, no one has found solid evidence of his birth. So the family moved several times in search of work. It's likely they spent time in Glasgow before they eventually settled in Dundee in around 1840. Why did they settle in Dundee? Because at that time, Dundee was a bit of an economic powerhouse. The jute mills were big employers, and that is where William found his work. He apprenticed to follow in his father's trade as a handloom weaver, and that would have put on hold any formal education he might have had access to. But he learnt while he learnt his trade, like Burns, he self-educated himself, and he said himself he took great delight in the reading of books, particularly cheap editions of Shakespeare's play that would have been readily available even to people on low wages such as himself. In 1846, he married a lady called Jean King, who was a fellow mill worker from Stirling, and they had about 5 sons and 2 daughters. And at the start of his career as a weaver, even though the Industrial Revolution had kicked off and weavers were kind of becoming obsolete, McGonagall was a skilled weaver. He'd apprenticed, so he kind of appeared to prosper. While many unskilled weavers were being put out of business, there was still high demand for the more skilled work that required great complexity and experience, which William had. But it was actually a bit of a bout of family hardship that led him to start to write. So while he was working in the looms, apparently he would entertain his shopmates with reciting works of Shakespeare. They all thought he was very good. They could have been taking the mick. It's possible they were just taking the mick out of him. But on one occasion, his colleagues clubbed together and paid a local theatre owner to allow McGonagall to appear in the title role of Macbeth. The play was already on, and they paid him. They were like, please let our mate William be Macbeth. And this is a great story, which kind of shows just what an absolute character he was, what a card. He was convinced that the actor playing Macduff was jealous of him, so he refused to die in the final act. And I'm sure you all know Macbeth, and dying in the final act is quite important to the overall narrative. So yeah, for this iconic performance, the Book of Heroic Failures actually awarded him the title of the worst Macbeth in the history of Shakespeare performances. So those are 2 titles he's got from the Book of Heroic Failures: the world's worst poet and the world's worst Macbeth, which are achievements in themselves, I think. But yeah, as I said, the turning point that led him to become an artist was in 1887. So by this point, advances in technology had meant that even the skilled work he was doing was becoming a bit more obsolete, and work was becoming more hard to find. And to compile his misery, his oldest daughter had, by the standards of the day, shamed the family by giving birth to an illegitimate child. So William was in a dark place in 1877, and I've got a quote from him here where he says, "I seem to feel as it were a strange kind of feeling stealing over me, and remaining so for about 5 minutes. A flame, as Lord Byron has said, seemed to kindle up my entire frame, along with a strong desire to write poetry, and I felt so happy that I was inclined to dance. And then I began to prance backwards and forwards in the room, trying to shake off all the thought of writing poetry. But the more I tried, the more strong the sensation became. It was strong, so strong. I imagine that a pen was in my right hand and a voice crying, "Write, write." I love the fact he compares himself to Byron, because comparing himself to other literary greats is a common theme with William McGonagall. But the first poem he ever wrote was an address to the Reverend George Gilfillan, which displayed all the hallmarks that would characterize his later works. And Gilfillan himself, who is an untrained and kind of poorly reviewed Christian preacher who occasionally dabbled in poetry himself, did comment admiringly, "Shakespeare never wrote anything like this," which is true. Shakespeare never did. But that might have gone to William's head. And let's just say things escalated from there. So one of my favourite episodes from the amazing life of William McGonagall was that as he realised that if he was going to succeed as a poet, he required a patron. So he wrote to Queen Victoria asking if she would patronise his poetry. He did receive a response. It was a letter of rejection, just simply written by some royal functionary, not the Queen himself, thanking him for his interest but declining his offer. But McGonagall may have been a little deluded, because he took this as praise for his work and decided to take a trip in 1879 to Dunfermline, where he was mocked by the Chief Templar of the International Organisation of Good Templars, of which he was a member, who told him that his poetry was very, very bad indeed. And McGonagall replied to this man with, "Well, it can't be that bad." This is his actual line. He said, "If it was so very bad that Her Majesty had thanked me for what the Chief Templar had condemned," which he hadn't thanked him at all. But this letter gave him, as you see later, gave him intense belief in his poetic abilities, and he felt that if the Queen just got the chance to hear his poetry, she would surely become his patron and his reputation would be boosted. So in July 1878, he walked from Dundee to Balmoral, a distance of about 60 miles, over mountainous terrain. I think he climbed over Glen Shima or something like that, through violent thunderstorm. He could have died. It was nuts, to perform for Queen Victoria. And there's an amazing, really detailed report in our newspaper collection about this episode, entitled, it was printed in 1878, I think it was printed in the Dundee Evening Courier, called "Extraordinary Freak of a Dundee Poet." And it goes into detail. It says how basically the guard said he had to go away, he was going to find himself in an asylum. It details what actually happened. So basically he hiked across the mountains, was able to get into the grounds of Balmoral, completely unannounced and unexpected, I may add, and got as far as the gate guards. And when they stopped him and said, "Who on earth are you?" he announced himself as the Queen's poet. And the guard replied, "You're not the Queen's poet. Tennyson is the Queen's poet," because Alfred Lord Tennyson was then the poet laureate. He presented this letter thanking him for his interest, but was still refused entry, and the poor chap had to return home. But this didn't deter him either. His poetry writing continued, and he actually shared his own account of these events with newspapers. So if you're curious about that, just pop his name in the newspapers and see what comes back. You'll get some really, really detailed responses. But yeah, throughout his life, he campaigned, as well as being into poetry, he was also into temperance. He campaigned against excessive drinking, and some of his performances were in pubs, where he would give these kind of moralistic, edifying poems and speeches on the dangers of strong drink. And another funny aside, is that this did often lead to him being chased out the pub by angry landlords. On one occasion, he was chased down the street and pelted with peas by an angry landlord, who basically told him to never come back to my pub. So he wrote loads more poems. If you want to read his poems, just have a look online. But despite how much he was working, he constantly struggled with money and was forced to subject himself to selling his poems in the street or reciting them in halls, theatres, public houses, and these performances were quite demeaning. He was laughed at, jeered at. He often had to rely on the financial support of friends who would support him with donations. He tried to make his fortune twice, once by sailing to London in 1880 and another time by sailing to New York in 1887, and sadly both ventures proved unsuccessful and he was forced to. But his one lucky break is also quite a tragic one. One period of his life where he did find consistent lucrative work was when he was hired by the local circus to perform his work. One of the conditions of this was that the audience were permitted to pelt him with herrings, eggs, flour, potatoes, and stale bread. So he'd be reading these poems while everyone would be blowing whistles, spinning rattles, throwing blooming fish at him, and eggs, flour, potatoes, stale bread. Poor chap, you know. And for this, he received 15 shillings a night. But apparently, McGonagall seemed happy with this arrangement, because when these shows became so raucous and the crowds became so wild that he got them going so much that the city magistrates were forced to ban them, he wrote an outraged poem in response entitled "Lines in Protest to the Dundee Magistrates." I won't read the whole thing, but here's one stanza. "Fellow citizens of bonny Dundee, are ye aware of how the magistrates have treated me? Nay, do not stare or make a fuss when I tell you they have boycotted me from appearing in Royal Circus, which in my opinion is a great shame and a dishonour to our city's name." More stellar work. So after this, he fell on hard times again. Unfortunately, the last years of his life were spent enduring real financial difficulty. In 1890, he was in really, really dire straits, and to help him, his friends funded the first publication of his collected works entitled Poetic Gems. They really are poetic gems. I believe you can still buy this online. And these proceeds provided McGonagall and his family enough money to live for a time. But not for good. And by 1893, he was getting very, very, very fed up with life in Dundee. And he actually wrote a poem promising to leave for good. And I've got a few lines from that here to prove it. So this is an 1893 poem called A New Year's Resolution to Leave Dundee. So it starts, "Welcome thrice, thrice welcome to the year 1893, for it is a year I intend to leave Dundee, owing to the treatment I receive, which does my heart sadly grieve. Every morning when I go out, the ignorant rabble, they do shout, 'There goes Mad McGonagall,' in derisive shouts as loud as they can bawl, and lift stones and snowballs, throw them at me. And such actions are shameful to be heard in the city of Dundee. I am ashamed, kind Christians, to confess that from the magistrates I can get no redress. Therefore, I've made up my mind, in the year of 1893, to leave the ancient city of Dundee, because the citizens and me cannot agree. The reason why? They disrespect me, which makes me feel rather discontent. Therefore, to leave, then I am bent. And I will make arrangements without delay and leave Dundee some early day." And even this poem prompted more criticism. One Dundee newspaper prompted out that he'd probably stay for another year once he realised that Dundee rhymes with 1893. But he did make good on his threat, and he moved to Perth the following year, where he stayed for a few years before moving to Edinburgh around 1900, where he was once again, around 1895, sorry, he moved to Perth, and then in 1895, him and his wife relocated to Edinburgh, where he did receive some welcome as a bit of a cult figure and was in great demand for a time, but this didn't last. By 1900, people had pretty much forgotten about him, and he was destitute, old, and sickly. He was too frail to walk the streets selling his poems. Many of the friends that donated to him had passed away themselves, and tragically, he did die penniless in 1902, above what is now the Captain's Bar in Edinburgh's South College Street, and was buried in an unmarked grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard. Thankfully, a slab was put there in 1999, inscribed with some of his own lines. It says, "William McGonagall, poet and tragedian, I am your gracious majesty, ever faithful to thee. William McGonagall, the poor poet that lives in Dundee." So that was his life. Sad end to a fascinating character. I love it, a good eccentric, and he certainly got a rank high on the list of great British eccentrics. But before I go, I did promise that I'd tell you a little bit about this amazing interview he gave. So I just got an email that distracted me. Oh, Rosie, don't do that to me. Welsh pronunciations. Yeah, I think Miko says you've all suffered enough. I wouldn't do that to you. Right, before we go, I'll give you a few lines from this fantastic interview. It's from an article printed in the Dundee Courier on the 27th of April, 1880. If you want to look it up yourself, I'm going to write a blog about this next week. I haven't had time this week, but I will write a blog about it. If you want to look at it yourself, just just search it on newspapers. McGonagall interviewed, because the article is titled "The Poet McGonagall Interviewed." So yeah, he was interviewed just ahead of one of his performances in Newport by a correspondent for the Dundee Courier. And the intro text to this interview, it's clear the angle the interviewer is taking, which is very, very mocking. Whenever he refers to McGonagall as a poet, it's in quotes. He calls him the son of song. And so it says, when we were announced, his hand was stretched forth in the most generous and condescending manner, which put us quite at ease. So the whole tone is quite sarcastic. So it says, as we entered, there stood the bard, his left hand leaning on a table, his right pressed against his side, like the handle of a Grecian vase. When we were announced, his hand was stretched forth in the most generous and condescending manner, which put us quite at ease. We raised our hat and bowed as gently as we could, for like McSycophant, we could never stand straight in the presence of a man so great. And this is in quotes again to show the sarcasm. We immediately expressed a sense of honour, the sense of honour we had in being introduced to the bard of whom we had heard and read so frequently. So yeah, not very kind interviewer, but here you go. So, oh yes, McGonagall replied with great gratification. Do you find poetry to pay? The correspondent inquired. McGonagall replied, and then said, for it is often said that poets are poor and all generally die in a garret. And he follows, and we instance the case of poor Burns, whose last moments were embittered by the cravings of wretched haberdasher for some paltry £5. They're baiting him here, really, I think, because McGonagall leapt on the chance to compare himself to Burns. So he said, ah, yes, like Burns, I too have been often craved. Then they ask you about what his performance is that night, and it was the 10th scene from Richard III, and he says, I play that well. Then the interview expressed a preference for a recital of his own work rather than that from those of Shakespeare. And this is where you see McGonagall wasn't helping himself. He replied, oh yes, I always find that those who come to hear me do that. You see, I am much more versatile than Shakespeare. The only man I've ever known who could come up to me in versatility was Edmund Kean. He could tell a story, he could sing a comic song and declaim a tragedy. When the interviewer said, did you ever think of writing a tragedy with yourself as the hero? No, McGonagall replied, but I have all the tragic feelings within me. So after this, the interviewers kind of smelt blood, and they asked him a bit about his own work and about how he thinks he's viewed by they asked him about his divine afflatus, basically how long it takes him to compose his great works. And he said he wasn't sure, but a long time, a very long time, he added. And then he went on to say how kind the papers were, which is quite mean because they actually weren't. They were being sarcastic the whole time. He said, oh yes, the papers are very kind in that way, and I am proud to learn that there are 2 members of the Edinburgh press here tonight to write notices of my appearance in Newport. This night in Newport is the greatest step in my life. And the sympathy is even built on more when you read the reports the Edinburgh journalists wrote. They were they were taking the mick. They were absolutely completely taking the mick. So the article went on to give a little bit of a description of his performance. They say he retired to his dark room, again in quotes, to add a nice heavy dose of sarcasm. But what they do, one of the things they do describe is how crazy the atmosphere in there was. So he said he bowed in acknowledgments and immediately struck an attitude, and with an air of comic tragedy, he recited something, if we might judge by the movements of his mouth. For little could be heard above the music of the whistles and the tumult of enraptured voices. When he finished with his oration, he retired to his dark room. Basically, they go on about how insanely loud it was in there, and people were standing, pressed right up the front, screaming at him. So they do a great description of his own description of, as they said, that terrible day in June when Bannockburn was lost and won. And he thrilled the audience with Prince Edward's commands. which were things like, "Now, archers, draw your arrows to the head and make sure you kill them dead." Another line that he did, "Edward turned his horse afar and never stood till he came to Dunbar." Another line, probably my favourite, "The English all fell into the pits and the Scotch took their swords and cut them to bits." So yeah, it's just a really great example of how interesting he was and how crazy his performances go. The interviewer ended with, "After this part of his exhibition, the entertainment soon came to a close. The poet bowed his farewells amid continued howling and music from whistles of muscle and tin. We were somewhat disappointed with the personal appearance of the poet. There was no evidence of a face sicklied over with the pale cast of thought, no dreamy lineaments, no sad expressive eyes, and no domed forehead. His crowning glory consists of jet black hair, with 2 locks projecting slightly front of his eyes, and the remainder thrown behind and terminating at the back of his head like the curl of a drake's tail. Adieu, Mr. McGonagall." There you go. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. McGonagall would have been amazing on Britain's Got Talent. I actually think you could do a pretty good film about his life story. I think it would make a fantastic kind of period comedy piece. Do you not think? Nico, maybe we write a screenplay. Anyway, thank you so much for tuning in, guys. I really hope you've enjoyed it. I will be back again next Friday. Have a great weekend. I'll post a link to our Friday's blog so you can explore the records. And I will speak to you all very soon. So take it easy. I will see you again soon. Massive thanks to Miko for helping out. Yeah. Happy Friday and have a wonderful weekend. Farewell.